Okay, my guest today is Toviah Moldwin. Toviah has done a PhD in computational neuroscience, and we're going to be discussing both neuroscience and machine learning and some other topics if we get to them. Maybe just to give people background, do you want to explain briefly what is computational neuroscience?
Yeah, sure. I wish I knew. No, so the way that I explain it is that there are two aspects to it. I mean, now I would say that there are maybe three aspects to it. So one aspect is just sort of the idea that, well, you have experimental neuroscience, right? What's experimental neuroscience is that you get various measurements from the brain, whether it's from an EEG cap or sticking electrodes in mouse brains or whatever it is that you're doing, right? So there are various ways of getting all sorts of different experimental data, and then you have to analyze that data. Now, the brain is a very complicated thing. And to understand what is going on, and if you just like look at the raw data, it doesn't tell you very much. So there's a lot of sort of sophisticated data analysis and processing that you have to use in order to make sense of what's happening in the brain. So that's the computational aspect. Number one is that you need to use various computational techniques to like actually just do the science. The second aspect I would say has to do with sort of the relationship between computers and the brain, and working on sort of more theory type things in that regard. So it's trying to understand the brain in terms of the computation that it does, and to maybe understand computation, especially now. I mean, now everyone is familiar with artificial neural networks, at least in name, because it's sort of the basis of these large language models and ChatGPT and all of these things. So part of it is trying to understand what are the sort of computations that the brain does, and whether we can, let's say, simulate them or implement them in software. Sometimes also hardware. There's also neuromorphic computing, which is hardware, right? Neuron-based computational hardware.
And what aspect, I guess, were you most driven to? Like, did you want to understand the brain? Did you want to understand how to make AI, or what most inspired you?
Yeah, so for me it was really about, it was initially about like let's kind of use the brain to inspire better AI. Now my perspective is different because AI to some degree for most tasks feels like it's solved. Right. So this is sort of a change in my perspective that started happening at around 2022. Like some of the papers that I published, especially one of them, the gradient clustron, I was like, it was sort of a brain inspired algorithm for like, this is how an artificial neuron could maybe learn differently, like a different kind of learning algorithm for an artificial neuron. I was like, well, maybe you could use this and it could make artificial neural networks better. And yeah, since that time, it's sort of like the engineers have figured it out. Engineers have figured AI out. There are some small things that are I mean, there are some things that are not so small. There are some things that are left to do, but we are rapidly approaching a point where AI is better than the brain anyway. So why bother? So now I'm a little bit more of a biologist. Like let's understand the brain kind of for its own sake. And right, it's definitely different than what we're using in AI. So even if AI works a particular way, it's interesting to see how the brain solves the same problems and whether it's similar and whether it's different.
Right. I mean, I would say even if AI is very powerful, there are clearly certain things the brain does very well, which we could maybe discuss in a second. So there might still be ways for AI to learn from that, unless we think that the brain, it's just like because it's biological, again, there's nothing we could learn from it, but presumably there'll be some things.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I don't mean to be like, I don't mean to be super cynical on that front, but I think that as an overall project, like AI has definitely done a bunch of neural inspired things, and a bunch of those have turned out well. But I think that at this point, the people who are like really at the forefront of AI for the most part are AI and machine learning engineers, and they're not neuroscientists, and they just like keep chugging away at the linear algebra and the calculus. And that just seems to be what the way forward is. Maybe they'll hit a brick wall and they'll need to go back to biology again, but it doesn't seem that that's particularly necessary at this point.
Okay, maybe we'll discuss that a little more, like some of the differences between the way that AI, like, large language models and other such neural networks work and how the brain works. What are some like key differences, I guess?
Okay, so this is a great question. To some degree, this is what my PhD thesis was about. So first of all, I should start with the similarities, and also I'll give a bit of history here. The the sort of the field of computational neuroscience, I would say, started in the 1940s with a publication by I think it's Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts. I don't remember if I might have switched their first two names, but McCulloch and Pitts, right? Then and they wrote a paper in the 1940s called "A Logical Calculus Immanent in Nervous Activity." And the claim was that the neurons, the individual cells in the brain, can effectively act as these simple computational devices, essentially kind of like logic gates. And that idea spawned the idea of the perceptron or the artificial neuron, which is what artificial neural networks use today. So the idea of an artificial neuron, just very, very quickly, right? An artificial neuron is a uh, mathematical unit that has a bunch of inputs, let's say 100 inputs. Each of those inputs has a certain weight, right? It's how important that input is to the neuron. You multiply the input by the weight, you sum them up, and the sum of those weighted inputs sort of determines what the neuron's response will be. And the game of learning in artificial neural networks is basically changing these weights such that you get an input-output function that you want. Right, so that's computational neuroscience in a few seconds. Now, in predator neural networks, the idea, like a single neuron on its own, can't do very much. In parentheses, there are works in my lab that show that it can do more than a simple neuron can do, but that's a biological neuron on a single biological neuron is more complex than a artificial neuron, and that's an important point. I'll get into that in a second. But yeah, a single neuron in principle does not do that much on its own. But when you put it into a network, a multi-layer network, these things are incredibly computationally powerful. So uh, what do I want to say here? So the part of the idea of an artificial neural network uh, is that in a normal computer program, you basically you write the computer program, and the computer program runs. It maps inputs to outputs. In artificial neural network or in a learning algorithm, generally that's not how it works. So in a learning algorithm, you don't write the algorithm, you don't write the input output function. You'll maybe decide what sort of the overall structure of the input output function is by designing the architecture of the network, but the actual sort of program, that input output function, is learned. So what do I mean by learned? It means that you give a bunch of examples to this artificial neural network, and from the examples, the network figures out what that function, what that mapping is supposed to be. So if you're talking about a large language model, it's mapping, your question to a good answer, for example. So you give it a bunch of text, and it can figure out from that what the next word should be. Yeah, I'll actually start on the network level, and then I'll move back to the single neuron level, just because my expertise is single neuron, so I'm going to come back to that. There are artificial neural networks that work like I described, which is that it's basically you take a bunch of these units and you put them together and you stack them into a network and you have it learn, and it produces the function that you want. With large language models, so there is a neural network that is part of the AI algorithm, but they have a lot of other stuff going on. So there's this part of a large language model that's called a transformer, which performs a very particular mathematical operation, which is it's essentially it's an engineering trick, right? So these sort of more modern AI systems combine the artificial neural network with like other things that just happen to work. And these models, I should say, including these artificial neural networks, the way that they're represented mathematically, what you really have is you have a bunch of matrices, which are basically like spreadsheets, right? So it's just like a big giant spreadsheet of a bunch of numbers. And so an artificial neural network can be represented in this way. And also these sort of other aspects and other engineering tricks they put in are also sort of represented as these like giant matrices of numbers. And they sort of, there's an XKCD comic where it's sort of like, how does machine learning work? Well, you take a big pile of like linear algebra and you stir it until you get the right answer. So that's kind of what these models actually look like internally on a computer. But in principle, they're based on this idea of these networks of individual neurons. Now,
Do you know
so
historically how much it was really influenced by the brain? Like, was it directly influenced from the brain itself, even if they ended up
yeah,
simplifying it?
yeah. So look, so the that 1940 paper that I was talking about, um, they, like McCulloch and Pitts were basically neuroscientists. One of them I think was actually an experimentalist, maybe both of them. I remember there was one of them who like co-wrote another paper called What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain. So they were like really neuroscientists, and they came up with this idea that was really a novel idea. And I should say also, by the way, so this paper spawned basically two entire fields, separate fields um, of computer science. So one of them is this like machine learning neural network stuff. There's also, if you remember from Arnold Libo's class in theory of computation at Yeshiva University, right? So if you remember finite state automatons, which are these sort of like simple theoretical computers, because like you have Turing machines, which is like a full computer, and then you have a finite state automaton, which is like a computer that can still like compute certain functions, but not all of them. A Turing function can compute all of them. So a finite state automaton is also based on that paper, right? So you have like these circles and these states and these arrows. Uh, yeah. So it was really spawned from this paper, and they were neuroscientists. They were trying to understand neurons. Now, there's also in terms of the learning aspect. So there's a perceptron paper which was written in the 1950s by, I think his name was Frank Rosenblatt, and so he came up with the learning algorithm. So in the original McCulloch and Pitts paper, from what I remember, there was no learning; it was just the structure of the neuron. So definitely the sort of origin of the field is in neuroscience. I think that can be said with a fair degree of confidence. So the way that it expanded, I mean, so there are certain aspects of modern artificial neural networks. So like convolutional neural networks, for example, are somewhat brain inspired, because convolutional neural networks are what at least people used to use. Maybe they still use them for image classification. So that's sort of based on how people think the human or the biological vision system works. But most of the sort of in between things and the learning algorithm, that's also something that we can talk about, right? So the specific learning algorithm that is used in artificial neural networks is not super biological, and there we can get into why. So yes, definitely like from its inception, artificial neural networks come from biology, but as they develop, I think it was more kind of an engineering.
Right. I think that would be similar to many areas of technology. I mean, the famous one people give is flying. Like they might have been inspired by birds, but obviously they had to go and build their own way that wasn't really based too directly on birds. Maybe here it's a
Yeah,
little
yeah.
more similar initially, but
I think it's a good analogy, but yeah, it definitely starts with that one paper by McCulloch and Pitts.
so I guess one question is, so even though like you mentioned that right now they don't even need to use the brain and they've already solved many areas, there are still certain things where the brain is much more efficient. So even though in some ways it's much less efficient because it's, it has to run biologically and it can't operate as fast, in some ways it's able to learn from much less data. So I think they say people are able to learn language with, I don't know, maybe around 1 million words, while these large language models are vastly, vastly, like many orders of magnitude. They have to process much, much, much more language to learn, at the same level as a child. So what do you think potentially are some of the reasons that might be why there's such a big difference in efficiency in that regard?
Um, well, I will correct you on one point, right? Which is an untrained large language model needs lots and lots of examples to learn language. A trained large language model does not, right? So if you so okay, wait. So I'm not this experiment, I'm sure, has been done. I don't know exactly the results, but I am like reasonably sure that if you train a large language model fairly well on a bunch of different languages, it can generalize to a new language fairly quickly. I don't know if it's on the same order of magnitude as a number of examples that humans do. And I don't know if this is true, but I'm reasonably confident, just because you see this a lot with these large language models, that they are right, that they generalize to a lot of tasks that people didn't expect them to generalize to. So I think that probably it is true that they can generalize to new languages. So my point with that is that, right, the human brain is not a blank slate, right? It's the product of millions of years of evolution. I mean, human evolution specifically, like, because human, right, language sort of starts with human. So language, maybe it's on the order of let's say 1 million years, or I'm not quite sure. But right, so we evolved our brains, and one of the things that our brains do is they learn, but they also do contain a lot of like stored information that's evolutionarily stored, right? So that's kind of similar to if you have a model, a large language model that is pre-trained.
I just want to push back a little bit on that because if you have a model that's
Sure.
pre-trained, it has an incredible amount of data in it. And the human brain, when it's born, there can't be that much data because, the entire genome is somewhat limited. Only a small percentage is going towards the brain. I don't know exactly what percent, and only a small percentage is different than what, chimpanzees are. So there has to be a pretty small amount of data kind of for language. It might be somehow very powerful, but it's not encoding like too many rules of language here. So basically, it seems that a baby is born, and whatever little things they have are encoded, but then they basically learn the entire concepts of language and everything about language.
Yeah. So I would be I would be reticent about making too many claims from the size of the genome. And the reason why is because the genome is a hyper compressed thing that, people talk about the genome as if it's like this standalone blueprint. But it's not really, in the sense that the genome molecularly, with a ton of other stuff that happens in biology inside the cell. And the genome, you encode for a particular protein, and maybe the code for that protein is small, but that protein might be, right, the things that it's able to do because of how chemistry works is like super complex, right? Yeah, so that's like, for example, like, yeah, let's give this example. Like if I say the words GPT, or if I type into my browser, I go to whatever the URL is for GPT, right? So just based on that thing, it pulls up it GPT, and I can ask it whatever I want. I typed in 10 letters into my browser. So that's kind of more the way that one should think about biology, I think. It's not just compressed information, it's also a reference to a much larger system of like biological molecules that can do incredibly complex things.
Well, I mean, just to approach it from another angle, and you would know more about this, if there's so much that's being pre-programmed, does that mean that the different areas of the brain are like significantly different? So is the language area of the brain and whatever the place where language ends up being processed vastly different than, the other areas? Because it would have to be at a minimum that way, and it would have to be that way even early on for there to be so much information built in.
Yeah. Right. So a couple responses to that. So first of all, I should say that my position on this question regarding language is like I don't know for sure. So in terms of anatomical differences between brain regions, so I should say there definitely are, but the information in a certain sense is not necessarily something that you would see in the anatomical macro structure when you just like look at the brain under a normal microscope. So just like in an artificial neural network, when I was talking about these spreadsheets of numbers, so a lot of these big artificial neural networks, these machine learning models, if you look at the parameters, they all just look like spreadsheets of numbers, right? What's important is the actual numbers. So the equivalent in brain anatomy, so you're talking about the parameter in biology, the thing that you can change, the weights that you can change that actually define the input output function of the brain or a particular brain region. So normally what we think that is what we call the synaptic strength. So synaptic strength, so if you have two neurons in the brain, and one of them fires an action potential, right? So neurons basically have this kind of binary code, right? It's called firing a spike or an action potential. Those are the words that we use. And it's kind of a one or a zero. Either there's a spike or not a spike. And that information can travel via synapse. Synapse connection between neurons. So the next downstream neuron will see that information, will see whether that spike happened. So the idea of a synaptic weight, this connection between two neurons, it could be stronger so that when that spike sort of propagates, right, it will induce a sort of larger signal in the receiving neuron, or it could induce a smaller signal, right? And it could also be negative. There's excitatory and inhibitories, right? So one neuron could cause another neuron to actually be sort of less excited. But and if it's excitatory, it causes the next neuron to be more excited. So kind of the sort of working theory of how information is stored, that I don't know if most computational neuroscientists will 100% agree, but it's something to do with this. It's something to do with the synaptic weight, the strength of the connection between the two neurons. Like I could talk a bit about, if you want, about like the biological aspect of what's actually going on there. But for, if you're just thinking about the computation, you can think of it as one of these numbers in the spreadsheet, right? So the anatomy might not be different at the macro level, but what's really matters is at the individual synapse, at the individual connections between neurons, what is the strength of that connection? But that being said, I will say, right, there definitely are differences between brain regions. The thing is that a lot of sort of the, kind of interesting stuff, especially that humans do, we tend to think a lot of that kind of computation happens what we call the cortex. In Hebrew, we call it the klipat hamach, because it's like the peel of the brain. It's sort of the outer layer of the brain. And cortex has actually a somewhat uniform anatomy all around. I mean, it's not quite uniform, but it has a kind of like typical structure where, um, you have something like 6 different layers, and there are certain specific cell types that are in each layer. And so the differentiation, the kind of differentiation that you might want to see in those like higher order, let's say, computational things, isn't really there. Where you do see differences in anatomy is, let's say, you have, let's say, the cerebellum, which is kind of in the back of your brain. So the cerebellum is kind of responsible for like coordinating, like motor action, coordinating movement, right? And the cerebellum has very different architecture than the rest of the brain. We have the hippocampus, which is responsible for storing memories. So that has its own kind of architecture. And if you compare it to a computer, so it's sort of like, as an analogy, it's like you have the hard drive, which is like a dedicated thing that's meant for storing information. You have the RAM, you have the CPU, and so on. But within the hard drive, right, the hard drive might contain all sorts of different programs, but you're not going to see that by cutting up the hard drive, right?
Obviously, after a person learned, there's going to be all these differences, and you won't be able to tell by cutting it up. But when it's pre-programmed, so if the cortex looks very similar, do you think those subtle connections already have been programmed by the genes to be very different, and like, the language area and the different areas of the cortex? Because that seems like a little harder. I don't know so much about it, but it seems a little harder to pre-program that in DNA, even if it's super compressed.
Yeah, it is a good question, and the short answer is I don't know. But I should say there are sort of two aspects to the synaptic weights. There's what I was talking about before, which is like what number specifically you have there, and there's a question of whether there is connectivity at all, right? So you can think of a binary connectivity matrix, right? Am I connected to you or not? And so I think it is potentially more plausible that that sort of information could be encoded in the genome, not necessarily on the level of a specific neuron, but let's say on the level of the overall statistics. And so maybe I can get into a little bit what I'm working, because I'm working now on connectomics, which is basically you have a piece of brain or something, depending on the organism, you have an entire brain, and you can and in that volume of brain, and the one that we have, this is from the microns data set from the Allen Institute. It's from the mouse visual cortex, and so there are something like 70,000 neurons, I think it is. It's in around a cubic millimeter of volume, so I think 70,000 neurons, something on the order of 300 million synapses, right? And based on that data set, you can look at let's say you take a particular layer of the cortex, so let's say layer 4, and you can look at the sort of distribution of where its synapses go. And this is something like, literally, I have a PhD student who I'm working with, and so he was showing me today exactly this. Right, you have these different neurons in layer 4. They're layer 4 pyramidal neurons, and they send their synapses. They send their axons. They make connections with other neurons, and you can look at the sort of statistical spatial distribution of where these synapses go. right? And so I think it is plausible that something about like the overall the statistics of how of the connectivity, maybe not on individual neuron level, but on the level of cell types, that potentially can be encoded in the genome. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, like how much compression would even be possible? Because I feel like the total data, when you take the genome and even if you uncompress it and you again only have a limited area of the genome relevant to this, that total amount of data still seems vastly less than what we're dealing with large language models. But yeah, I guess that's like an interesting question.
Yeah, I'm not sure. This is also, I mean, it's also a question in linguistics, right? Because linguistics for a long time was dominated by Noam Chomsky's view that you have this sort of syntactic structure. But you learn about this in computer science because essentially it's relevant for like compiler theory or whatever. But the idea, right? So Chomsky had this idea that like there's a particular structure of syntax that all languages have, and that's sort of hard coded into your brain somehow. And now with these artificial neural networks, there is sort of this sense that no, you can just learn everything. But like you were saying, like you can't, if the way that we work is like these large language models where really you have to take in a huge amount of data, that's probably not all that's going on, right? It's probably not all learning. So something does have to be hard coded. And in a sense, like it might be that actually encoding just the sort of syntactic structure of Chomsky and certain other like important, let's say, statistical primitives about language, right? It might be that if you actually know what to encode in terms of like the structure of language, that's actually not that much information. The hard part is, figuring out what those things are.
Right. I mean, to me, like if I just hear that the cortex is so similar and it's used in so many different ways, I would think that it's somehow figured out this really good general learning algorithm. And then the genetic tweaks in each area are maybe very minor that just give it, a certain bias in a certain direction, but just actually it's a very small amount of information that they're encoding. And then it somehow is able to learn very efficiently after that. But yeah, not
Yeah,
sure.
so I would, yeah, it's definitely possible. It could definitely go either way. It is right. It is possible that either you'll get inspired by neuroscience or not. The people who do machine learning figure out that, oh, there's actually a much better way to learn language, and we can do it with much smaller models. Right? That's like totally possible thing that could happen.
Right, I feel like they need to learn some more efficiencies there because each time they train a new model version, it's like requires so much data and they're like restarting from scratch. So either they need some way to take the previous model and like recreate it, but based on the previous one, or they maybe need to try to learn from the brain and encode some very basic ideas to make things more efficient.
Yeah, it could go either way. And I am kind of agnostic as to which one. Like one important thing to think about is the fact that speech seems to be somewhat unique among humans. Maybe I don't know, maybe dolphins or something also have some sort of speech. But it seems to be kind of unique among humans, and it's a big question why. And some of it is probably a cognitive thing. There are people who theorize that it's also partially like a muscular thing. So there are people who look at more primitive versions of humans and they look at like the architecture of their vocal tract, but it seems to be largely a cognitive thing. And so it's a question because if you look at the brains anatomically of, let's say, a monkey and a human, and you look at let's say what would be the speech areas for the human, I'm not sure that you would yeah, I'm not sure that like at an anatomical level you would see something different. I'm not sure, somebody's probably done that. But it's also like if you look at the individual synapses, would you see some difference in distribution? And that I'm not sure either. So yeah, so it might just be a network size thing, like how many neurons do you have? And you certainly, humans definitely have a lot of neurons, especially compared to their body mass, right? So there's this classic chart of so people think that like intelligence among animals is basically a function of I think it's the brain mass over the body mass. Right. So you definitely have animals that have bigger brains than humans, like elephants or whatever. But if you divide the brain mass by the body mass, humans are kind of unique in that regard.
Well, if the
So
neurons are bigger, So then it doesn't help that
Right,
it's a
right,
bigger
right,
brain.
right,
Also why
right.
birds could
So
be pretty smart even though their absolute size of their brain can't be that big.
yeah, so number of neurons is probably more important than size. Size matters for like certain electrophysiological properties, maybe, but a lot of those things seem to be like there are corrections for them. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so you mentioned connectomics. Maybe could you just provide like a kind of a brief overview and some of the challenges in that field?
Yeah, okay. So connectomics is the study of, let's say, the microanatomy of the brain, or nanoanatomy, depending on what word you want to use. So what I mean by microanatomy is that you want to be able to see on an individual level the neurons, 80 or 86 billion neurons that are, somehow all fit into your head. So you want to see how they connect to each other. So who makes a synapse with who, and that's the basic idea. So it's really getting an understanding of the anatomy of the brain at a cellular level. And in fact, it's actually a subcellular level because what they do is they you take a brain out of somebody's body. Hopefully, they're dead. I mean, if it's I mean, they will be dead by the time you take it out of their body. That's usually the case. Like sometimes you have usually when you have human samples, if you have live human samples, often they will be taken from live patients who have brain surgery done on them. So people who have like severe epilepsy or whatever other issues. So sometimes the surgeon will take out some live tissue from that surgery, and like some of the tissue is maybe damaged disease tissue, but some of it is not disease tissue, and they will do various tests to like make sure that it's not disease tissue. But if you're using animals, you kill them, and I think human samples that currently exist, I think at least some of them are post-mortem. So I should say also, so in order to do this, you need very specialized technology. You need an electron microscope, which is a microscope that is able to see very, very small things. So you can actually see the individual sort of organelles inside the cell. So for example, you can see mitochondria, right? They're very evident in the cell. And these electron microscopes, they normally scan a plane, right? They scan basically like a flat square. So when you do this connectomic work, the way that they do it is that they basically have a knife they're like a very, very sharp, I think they use a diamond actually, and they slice off a very thin sheet of the brain, and then they image it, and then they take another slice and another slice and another slice, and it's a stack. It's a stack of all these 2D images. Now, if you just look at an individual 2D image, it looks like a bunch of like bubbles. So you actually have to computationally reconstruct the 3D structure of the entire cell, which there are algorithms to do. Uh,
The
and yeah,
cell
and
and
for that,
also everything coming out of the cell, I guess, not just the cell body.
right. I mean, it's still the axon is the wire that it sends. The dendrites are the wires that receive. But they're all considered to be part of the cell, and these they're also, I mean, together the axon and dendrites are called processes. Sometimes neuropil or the neurites or the whatever word you want to use. And so I mean, the dendrites are not necessarily, I mean, compared to the axon, they're not that big. The cell body is very small, right? The cell body is very small, right? Most of the length and volume of a neuron is in its axon and its dendrites. The dendrites are these branches coming out of the cell body, and this axon is sometimes a very long thin wire that can go across the brain if it wants to. It can stay local if it wants to. And so, yeah, so part of the challenge, there are a number of technical challenges that come just from that. Now, I should say, by the way, there are a few labs around the world who are doing this thing. So there may be, I don't know, on the order of like 20 labs that are actually like cutting these brains. And it will be for different animals. You have fly, you have mouse, you have C. elegans, which is a worm. And for technical reasons, there is a limit to the size of the tissue that you can um, image in this way. So for example, you can get like I think they did the entire worm. So you have the whole C. elegans, but it's only something like 302 neurons. You have fruit fly. You have, I think, the whole organism, which is that paper you sent me, right? So I think for the fruit fly, they definitely have the whole brain connectome, and I think they might have the body also. Once you get to mouse brain, and certainly human brain, right? So like I said, the sort of largest volumes that we have is around a cubic millimeter. So the human mammals generally, you're only getting a piece. Now, there are a lot of challenges that come from the fact that you only have a piece because you don't know like this is one of the big challenges that we have in the data set that we're using, this Allen Institute data set. And I should say this is a very timely podcast because they just the Allen Institute, which has put out this connectome, this mouse visual cortex connectome that we're working on, they actually put out their big publications. There's actually 10 separate papers that they put out in one issue of Nature. So we were actually trying to buy this volume of Nature to read all of these papers. It's very unusual, right? Normally, like Nature it's like different labs submit, everybody submits an article. This is like 10, 10 papers from the same data set. This is like a big, and so that just came out like a couple of weeks ago. They officially published it. It was available online for like the data set was available for a long time. Like we've been working on it since before they published the paper. Where was I going with this? Right, but that's a cubic millimeter. So one of the challenges that you have is, yeah, like I said, so you're only getting part of the brain. So that part of the brain will have a lot of synapses that you have no idea where they come from. So in fact, in our slice that we measured, so we know about 5% of the synapses. We know the cell that they came from because that 5% of the synapses come from other cells that are within our cubic millimeter. The other 95% are coming from outside of our cubic millimeter, right? So that's a big challenge with working on at least mammal connectomics. There are also just like general computational problems. Like I said, they have to sort of like reconstruct the 3D structure of these cells. So that has to be done algorithmically, and it's very not trivial because they have to basically trace a 3D object through a stack of 2D images. And there are various algorithms to do it, but none of them are perfect. So sometimes you'll be following an axon, and it like in one of your slices, it just becomes very small in the image for whatever reason. It's like there are other things pushing up against it, and the algorithm just like can't follow it anymore. And then so you have no idea where that axon is going. You lost the axon. And so different labs have different algorithms, and some are better than others. And it's also like the microscopy, the quality of the images itself. There are differences in the sort of preparation, like the medium that you put the slices into, because you don't just take the raw slices and put them into a microscope. You have to add certain chemicals in order to be able to like visualize everything. So there are a lot of technical challenges like that. I should say, because you're at Google, so Google is actually involved in this project, right? So Google has this thing called Neuroglancer, which is it's basically it's software that you can access online, and these data sets people will, I guess they send them to Google. I don't quite know how it works, but you can actually look through this connectomic brain tissue, right? So this is normally what people will do, is if they want to see what's going, they just want to see, okay, what's going on in this particular region of the brain. So you go to the Neuroglancer website and you go in there and you see all these neurons, and you can click on the one you want. You can zoom in, do all of these things.
Well, even in terms of understanding the brain, let's say, so you could approach it from like a higher level, like let's see what happens, how people learn, things like that. Or you could zoom in like this and like actually look at the individual neurons. I'm just wondering, like it's pretty hard when you're looking at individual neuron and even a whole group of them, like to actually figure out what's going on when, with complex learning and language and all these things. So I'm wondering how close are they where they'll be like, oh yeah, we see this neuron does this and we understand how this process works.
Right. So yeah, that's an important question. So I will say that there are sort of two different complementary ways of looking at this data. One way is like we are talking about, that you just like look and zoom in and zoom out. The truth is that you're not, just by doing that, by looking individually at a bunch of different neurons, you're not going to learn very much. It is very valuable to have this tool, though, because I don't know, you just kind of like need it. If you're doing any sort of analysis, it's just like useful to be able to do that. In practice, if you're trying to like actually get insights into brain function, that's not right. You don't go to this tool, but usually you will download. So what we do is we work with you have a data set of the synapses. So it'll basically tell you the position of the synapse, who the synapse belongs to on the presynaptic side, who it belongs to on the postsynaptic side. I forgot if I define these terms. The presynaptic just means the neuron that's sending the information. Postsynaptic means the neuron that's receiving the information. So like the kinds of analyses that we're doing now So I should say initially what I was interested in is looking at these synaptic weights, like I was saying before, right? So the strength of the connection. Now, how do you tell the strength of a connection from connectomics data? So it is not obvious. Like really what you want is you want to have like electrophysiology where you actually like stimulate one neuron and see how much it affects the other neuron. Right. That's like sort of the real synaptic weight. And also I'd say it's not always consistent, right? So you do the same experiment, you'll get different results because it's biology. So when you're doing connectomics, when you're looking at these sort of frozen brain slices, you're not doing experiments on them. So what is the synaptic weight, right? What is that? So there are a few different things that you can look at, and you see these in the raw images. So on the presynaptic side, there are chemicals called neurotransmitter. That those are the chemicals that are released to send along the signal, and those are contained in vesicles. Vesicles are sort of like these spherical-ish objects that kind of just contain these neurotransmitters, and you can see them in the electron microscope, and you can count them if you want to. So that's like one way. So look, in theory, the number of vesicles should be related to the strength of the connection because more vesicles means like more neurotransmitters released.
Just
There's
quickly on
also
that, when they talk about how, neurons that fire together wire together, that number of vesicles increases each time. Like that's actually what happens physically.
so okay, the plasticity. Well, so because you mentioned it, okay, this like with the other, this is my PhD is about plasticity. The mechanisms of changing synaptic strength are, yeah. So one of them potentially is that you increase the number of vesicles. So that's a possibility. There's also something called short-term plasticity, which is not normally what people talk about when they talk about plasticity, but it's another thing, right? So there is this idea that so you have these vesicles and they're released. So on short time scales, right, you're depleting the neurotransmitter. So this actually matters if you have something that's like very strong, bursting spikes, like a lot of spikes one after another, right? It can actually decrease the strength of the signal. So normally when I think about plasticity, I think about the postsynaptic side. So this is the other half of it. So I normally think about, yeah, so the on the postsynaptic neuron that's receiving these neurotransmitters, so there are proteins called receptors that receive the neurotransmitter, and the number of these receptors can actually change. So these can be like inserted or removed from the membrane. So the way that I think about it is that sort of the first thing that happens is on the postsynaptic side, that because the postsynaptic neuron ultimately is like the one that kind of knows what happens, right? Because the presynaptic neuron doesn't know if the postsynaptic neuron fires, right? At least not immediately. Like there has to be some sort of information that so the way that I think about it is that the postsynaptic neuron first realizes that it has to do plasticity, so there are some changes that happen right away, and probably there are some receptors that are put into the membrane. And I think that there are chemical pathways for the postsynaptic spine to talk to the presynapse, and it may also increase the number of neurotransmitters on the presynaptic side. But I'm less of an expert on the presynaptic aspect, but I will say that generally these things are correlated, right? So if you look, there was a paper in 2015 called Nanoconnectomic Upper Bound on Synaptic Variability or something by Sejnowski and Kristen Harris, these people. And they basically went and looked at all of these. There are a bunch of these parameters that are kind of associated with synaptic strength, like structural parameters. So the number of vesicles is one of them. The sort of size of the synapse, I think actually the postsynaptic density size. The postsynaptic density is like the area, basically the area where all these receptors are, and you can kind of measure it because it shows up on the electron microscope image. And all these things tend to be correlated with each other, right? So it seems that biology is kind of doing everything in tandem. So it's increasing the size and increasing the number of receptors and increasing the number of presynaptic vesicles. Now, I should say, this perspective, like when you hear a lot of like pop neuroscience stuff, they'll the myelin sheath or you'll have like part of like your like the visual area of your brain rewired to your auditory area if if you go blind or something like that. And that sort of stuff does happen, but that's not like the main thing that the brain uses to store information. The main thing that the brain uses to store information is like very synapse specific. It's very localized, and it happens yeah, it happens at the synapse, right? Because if it were, let's say, the myelin sheath, right? So the myelin sheath like covers the axon. If it were just like changing the width of the myelin sheath, right, that would affect every single neuron that the presynaptic neuron communicates with, which is not what you want. You want it to be specific to the pair of the presynaptic and postsynaptic neuron. Yeah.
But just back to connectomics. So in terms of where it will be in understanding functions, is it only when we have like live samples that we could prod and like stimulate one neuron, or are there ways we could understand function from it in another way? Like where is it going in terms of just practical understanding of how the brain it works overall?
Yeah. So I will say, I mean, you sent me that paper about the fly model that they made like actually behave like a fly. So people are already working on structure to function. Some of the so I will say that the figuring out the weights, right, which is again the actual sort of information, and extracting that from the images is difficult. Like you can sort of approximate it, but the numbers that you get aren't going to be super exact. So those are more useful for sort of making broader statistical claims rather than like hard coding them into a model and see whether that works. I think people have also um have they tried hard coding it into a model? I don't know. But there are definitely people who are like, let's make a neural network that's has the same connectivity structure, right? The connectivity structure is like the binary connectivity structure of the connectome. It's like, let's make this an artificial neural network and see what happens. And so there are various projects that are taking place to do this sort of thing. I will say, so I was affiliated with the Blue Brain project, which has since no longer exists. But the Blue Brain project, the idea was to simulate a whole brain. This was kind of pre-connectomics. It's a very politically controversial project for all sorts of reasons, which I won't get into. I shouldn't say it was pre-connectomics. It was sort of alongside connectomics, but it was before we have the sort of size of data sets that we have now. And so they were trying to build a simulation of the whole brain, not based on exact microstructure details, but based on sort of certain statistical assumptions of, say, the distribution of synapses and the things that we know from various experimental sources. And so they were trying
They
to
were
do a
working on the
simulation.
human brain. That's what they were starting with.
So they I think we're starting with a mouse brain, but there might have been people who were working on scaling it up to human. I think they were a little bit agnostic about the because a lot of the anatomy between mouse and human is fairly similar, right? It's more a matter of like number of neurons, and so it's more sort of like get the basic thing working and then scale it up. So yeah, I mean that project, there's a lot to say about it. I mean, I was generally in favor of the project. I'm a little bit biased because I know the people there and we collaborated with them and things like that. I thought it was a valuable undertaking. I think that we learned certain things from it. But yeah, so at the end of the day, if you were going to do a project like that, it would be good to like really have the full connectome and to really know like exactly what the connectivity structure is. Like it would be very useful to have that. But I think that even if you're not going to do a full brain simulation, and I do think at this stage attempts to do that are a little bit premature. Uh, there are people who are into that sort of thing, and they're like, yeah, let's put it in a thing and simulate it. I'm a bit more skeptical. I like to my perspective is let's try to understand what's happening at a structural level, and see just by if you do a deep analysis of the structure, it can maybe tell you something about the function without even having to run simulations, but just look at because biology has a certain logic, right? Your leg bone is connected to your hip bone, and so and sometimes just by looking you can figure things out. So what does it mean just looking in connectomics? It's not necessarily just looking at the neurons and neural glands are. But what we're trying to do now, like I said, and people have done this at a lot of different angles, but yeah, right now we're sort of looking at the sort of statistical structure of connectivity. So there are different cell types in the brain. It depends on how you count. So there are certain um yeah, there are different like categories of cells. So the first of all, there's like categorization that you can do based on neurotransmitters, so excitatory and inhibitory, but you also have like all of these neuromodulators, dopamine and so forth. So that's like one aspect of classification. There's also the morphology. How does a neuron look? What's the three-dimensional structure? There's the electrical categorization, which is what are the electrical properties of this neuron? Because neurons are electrical devices. And there is also the sort of not the genotype, but there's the like the transcriptomic aspect, right? So certain right different cells in your body will express different genes in terms of like what is actually written, what part of the genome is actually written to RNA. Right, so you have different ways of classifying these cells. The most sort of basic is the morphological, because you could just like look at them and see that they're different. And it's also the case that the cell type is location dependent, right? And so some of the cell types are actually, they'll have a name like a layer two pyramidal cell or a layer four pyramidal cell, right? Because you have certain cells that are in layer two of the cortex and certain cells that are in layer four of the cortex, and both of them like to reach up to the top of the cortex, right? They like to reach up to layer one. So practically what that means is that the layer two cells will be a lot smaller. Layer four cells will be larger, right? They'll be taller, but just because they're both reaching all the way up, right? So layer four pyramidal neuron has a different morphology, a different structure than layer one neuron. So yeah, so you have these different cell types in different layers. And one of the questions you can ask is, what is the basic architecture of the cortex, right? How is this thing built? And so you can sort of visualize, okay, where are the layer four neurons sending their synapses, right? What layer are they sending their synapses to? And within the cortex, there are also it's not just layers, but there are also structures called columns, which is that you seem to have sort of units that have on the order of, I don't know what, maybe on the order of tens of thousands of cells. I don't really know how many cells is in a cortical column. But the point is, you have a bunch of different bunch of cells that are in this sort of unit, and they're all communicating with each other. So you have this in mouse barrel. So mice have whiskers, right? So the mice use their whiskers to feel things, and it's very important for how they traverse the world. And so each of their whiskers is associated with something. It's like a barrel, which is sort of like column type structure in what's called the barrel cortex. And so each of these barrels, each of these columns is like responsible for one whisker and processing the information from one whisker. And you can see these barrels like anatomically, like you look at a microscope, and they're like fairly clearly differentiated. So there are a lot of things like that are not necessarily about knowing the exact information, but understanding the architecture, the like micro architecture of how this system is set up.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, it's interesting just to get like an overview of the issues involved. I guess one more thing, just in terms of your own research, maybe you want to talk a little bit more about single neuron learning, just what you studied there and kind of takeaways there.
So the thing is that, you had asked before about the relationship, about basically how brains and artificial neural networks are similar. So in terms of the learning, they can be sort of more similar at the single neuron level, and the challenge kind of happens with when you get to larger networks. So at the single neuron level, if you just have a single neuron and you want to get it to learn, the algorithms to get it to do that are fairly simple. There's right, to do like standard classification problems, so like to tell it to distinguish between pictures of dogs and cats or something like that. There's the algorithm called the perceptron algorithm, which basically it changes the synaptic strengths of the inputs to the neuron depending on basically what the target is, what the neuron was supposed to do, what it was supposed to fire or not. So this kind of learning, essentially, what you need is to supervise. This is called supervised learning. So you need something to tell you what the right answer is. You need something to tell you what the output of the neuron is. So that's sort of the spike, and you need something locally to tell you what the inputs are. So it turns out that a lot of these things are sort of integrated via calcium. So that's one of the major things that I worked on was this calcium based model of plasticity, which is essentially that when certain things happen when you have presynaptic input or a postsynaptic spike, so calcium enters the synapse. And that serves as a signal for all this other plasticity stuff to happen, for the receptors to be inserted into the membrane and so forth. And it actually, like the calcium signaling is an incredibly versatile thing. One of the papers in my PhD is called the calcitron, which was to try to explain how based on like very simple model of like calcium signaling, how you can get all these different learning algorithms in a single neuron. Now there are important differences between the simple neuron and a biological neuron. So one of the differences, if you just like look at a picture of an artificial neuron, it's a circle. If you look at a biological neuron, right, it has like all these like branching structures, and so that may matter. Right, that may actually be really important, this structure, for all sorts of biophysical reasons. So
Do you mean the fact that
uh,
it branches out in a different way than artificial neurons, or that the inside the cell
well,
body itself is
I
different?
mean, no, the branching. So why does it matter? There are a few different reasons. So first of all, the signal has to travel from the branches to the cell body to be integrated, and so there's something called voltage attenuation, which basically means that the signal is smaller uh, if it has to travel a long distance. So that means that like where the synapse is on the dendrite may matter. That's just in terms of like the overall strength of the signal. But they're also potentially, and this is one of my works, the gradient clusteron. I think I mentioned it before, was about this. There are interactions between synapses that are next to each other. This has to do with the NMDA receptor, which I won't get into. But the fact that you might have local interactions on these branches potentially means that the neuron is not this sort of a simple mathematical object. It is actually a complicated mathematical object that's performing some sort of complicated function where you have like these local inputs that are sort of integrated locally, and then that information is passed down to the cell body. So
So is that part of
yeah.
like, how an artificial neural network, it's extremely simple function basically that, will sum up the inputs and then there'll be a simple function to decide what it outputs. And is this the way the neuron differs in that it's doing these more complicated things in the branches?
Right. So it potentially is a difference. Now I will say, like, one of the models that people use to understand to understand the computation in the branches is from Yoda Parazi and Bartlett Mel. It's called the two-layer model, where basically you conceptualize the single neuron as a network. So like the branches are sort of a layer of the network, and then the cell body is like another layer of the network. But if that's your model, then practically speaking, right, like the individual neuron is different, but you can model the neuron as a two-layer network. Now in our lab, David Beniguiev, a good friend of mine. So he did this thing where he actually tried to model the input output function of a neuron using a deep convolutional neural network. He got to very high accuracy. So he was able to sort of predict or reproduce the input output function of a biological neuron. I'll put an asterisk there. It's not real biological neuron. It is a simulation of a real biological neuron. Right? A decent understanding of the biophysics of real neurons, and they're like there's a simulation language called Neuron where you can put together like biological neuron with the branches and everything, and you have the electrical properties and we have the equations to make it work. So that's like what we do a lot in the lab. But David was able to train an artificial neural network to basically reproduce the input output function of a biological neuron, which means that even if at the individual neuron level the biological neuron is more complicated, the solution to that, if you are a machine learning engineer, is like, okay, just make a bigger network.
How big of a network do you need to stimulate a single biological neuron?
I'd have to look at this paper again because I don't remember. Is something like 7 or 8 layers, but it's also a question of like how high prediction accuracy do you need. So for right, if you just have a two-layer model like the original Horazi and Mel paper, I think they got up to like 85-90% accuracy. So like it may be that that's sufficient for many purposes. There's another important aspect while I'm talking about David's work, right? So there's also this aspect of there's a temporal aspect also. So neurons, right, in an artificial neural network, it basically gets like all the information at the same time immediately. In the brain, things are happening at different times, and because of how the biophysics works, there's sort of like an integration time window. And this also depends on the location of the synapse also, right? Because if you're far away, it takes longer for the signal to reach the cell body and so forth. So there's like all spatial temporal game going on in biological neurons that isn't really going on in these artificial neural networks. Now, can you replicate the spatiotemporal stuff in an artificial neural network? Again, yes, you can. So I think, yeah, like most of the complexities of biological neurons, you can replicate it with artificial neural networks. I think simply because, in a certain sense, artificial neural networks are like general. I mean, they're called universal function approximators, right? If you have an artificial neural network with an infinite width hidden layer, it can approximate any function. There's a proof for this. Um, it's like if you have a big enough artificial neural network, like you can generally do whatever you want.
So,
Right.
do you think the
Yeah.
fact that biological neurons are so much more complicated that they require all these layers to simulate it, do you think that's just like, incidental of how biology works and how evolution works? Or do you think there's actually like large benefits there? Whether or not we need to copy it with artificial machine learning, maybe there's just very large benefits biologically speaking.
Yeah, I think that's almost certainly true. I mean, biology has a lot of constraints. Biology has energy constraints. Biology has all sorts of evolutionary pressures. But yeah, biology has to worry about a lot of different things. Like for example, heat. So I mean, if you have if so you have this like giant cooling system that goes through however many thousands of liters of water a day, right? So your body has to deal with that sort of thing, and that's another constraint that it has, right? So yeah, I think that this is like a general question in biology, all right? If you see something that works a certain way, it's like, well, why does it work that way? It's like probably it's optimal for something, but that optimality is along a lot of different frontiers, and you don't necessarily know what they are. And also, like sometimes it's not. Like all these people who, you have like people like Dawkins or whatever. People who like to argue against religion point to like certain things in biology that are stupid. Like I don't know, like the giraffe's stomach or something. Like there are certain things that like in biology that don't seem to make any sense. But in general, if you talk to a biologist about like why a biological system is a certain way, it's like there's probably a reason for it, right? So, like normally that's the working assumption. So if you assume that everything is stupid, everything right, it's just it's not a good assumption to start working with.
Right. I mean, some of it could be tied to constraints of how it has to develop and evolve, but not tied necessarily to like how it could work if you're taking like a big picture view. So like maybe it's inefficient to have a neuron do so much individual computation, but it evolves that way because initially, let's say individual neurons were doing all the computation on their own and brains develop later. I'm just speculating. So like that could still be a fair question, I feel like, to wonder about.
Yeah. So we generally I think don't think that individual neurons evolves on their own. I forget. I once looked up what we think is like the most evolutionarily primitive thing with neurons, but I don't remember. But yeah, well, but the thing is, like we have lots of single-celled organisms that can do a lot of stuff, right? Like a cell in principle is a very powerful device. I mean, in a sense, when you talk about neurons as these things that integrate electrical signals, I mean, they're very, very powerful when you talk about them in networks. But if that's your view of how neurons work, that they integrate, electrical signals and just perform some mathematical operation on them, in a sense, that's a lot less sophisticated than your like amoeba or whatever, right? That has to find food and sense chemical signals and divide. Right? There's a lot more that goes on in cell biology than just passing along these electrical signals. And so that's also, I think, like an important thing to consider beyond the maybe these like functional differences that you can maybe talk about by having different more complicated input output functions. But it's also like it's a cell. It has DNA. It has transcription. It has proteins. Like if cell wanted to, for whatever reason, just decide to scale down all of its synaptic weights because it was having a bad day. Like it could do that. Biology has a lot of stuff to control things that you're not necessarily thinking about when you're just dealing with simple artificial neurons.
Right. Yeah, I mean, cells themselves do a lot of computation. They just don't have a way to coordinate kind of like across, multicellular organisms. And so I guess you kind of need neurons to like, I want this muscle to operate and not that muscle. And you kind of need something to coordinate that.
Yeah.
Okay, so for the last topic, we're going to be a little more speculative, not something we could maybe figure out tomorrow by looking at neurons. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about consciousness, your views of consciousness. So, just for the big question of consciousness, do you think this is something that, just like we explained life and to a certain extent intelligence, we'll also be able to explain consciousness in a similar manner, or do you think it's fundamentally different?
I think it's fundamentally different. But let me provide a bit of general background here. So people talk about what's called the hard problem of consciousness, and I guess the soft problems of consciousness. Right. So there are a lot of ancillary questions related to consciousness, which are essentially scientific questions and have scientific answers. So for example, yet what let's say under what conditions of brain activity is a stimulus perceived or not perceived, right? So, for example, right, people do these experiments where you put some sort of image on a screen and you flash it very quickly, and depending on how quickly you flash it, or you have or you have a mask, you have something that comes up afterwards, like very quickly, something like this. So, will you perceive it? And if you look at, let's say, a fMRI scan or something like that, so even if you don't consciously perceive the stimulus, or you don't think you consciously perceive the stimulus, but there might be some brain activity in your visual areas, meaning that there was some processing that happened. Um, and uh, but you still don't perceive it, right? So there seems to be like some kind of processing, or the brain activity has to, let's say, go to a certain brain region, or has to be a certain amount spread, or whatever you want to say, in order for you to consciously perceive something. Right. So these are like experimentally testable questions, and you can answer them, and they're interesting. And there are a lot of people in neuroscience who work on these sorts of questions, and it's basically called neural correlates of consciousness, right? So because there are things that are correlated with your conscious perception. So these are things that, generally speaking, I would say I would put under the category of the soft problem. And then there's what is called the hard problem of consciousness, which is like what is the nature of consciousness itself? In other words, what is sort of when I feel happy or sad, or when I experience a breeze on a summer day, right? That subjective feeling that I have, what it feels like from the inside. What is the explanation of that, beyond just saying, oh, these neurons fired and those neurons fired, right? Because the experience of the breeze, or of the color blue, or of the taste of a pickle, right? All of these things are sort of categorically different from the firing of neurons. So how do you kind of bridge that gap? And that is what is called the hard problem of consciousness. So just to give a lay of the land before I state my personal view. So I would say there are broadly three and a half or four. Well, say three and a half different schools of consciousness, depending on whether you're a lumper or a splitter. So one view, which I think I think is, was kind of popular, I'd say, in the previous generation. I'm a little bit biased because I have my own views, of course. But there was a time period when people were very into physicalism, which basically means that consciousness is a physical phenomenon. It sort of arises, or is identifiable with the activity of your brain, right? So that's physicalism. That consciousness is somehow physical. What does physical mean? That's a very difficult question. We can talk about that. There is the view called functionalism, which states that that consciousness is sort of the product of computation. So the brain can be thought of as a computational device, as we discussed. Like, in a certain sense, there's an input, there's an output, and so computationalism claims that it's not necessarily sort of the physical medium of the brain that matters so much as the computation that it performs. The second and a half view, I would call informationalism, and I put IIT integrated information theory in this category, which says that it has something to do with information, right? So somehow information and how it is moves around in a particular informational system, right? That's sort of the basis of consciousness. And then there's dualism, which says that consciousness is just a different thing than all these other things. And so I personally am a dualist. And the reason that I am a dualist, it's almost a sort of first principle sort of thing. It's kind of like, if you think about, like, what are the categories of things that exist? What does existence mean? I don't know. But um, I'm familiar with tables and chairs and that sort of thing. People call physical objects. It's not necessarily what a physicist would call a physical object, but right. So I'm familiar with matter. Let's put it that way, and I'm familiar with abstract concepts like mathematical objects. So, in a certain sense, one can say that there is such a thing as a sphere, right? A perfect sphere, a platonic sphere, or you could talk about a 10-dimensional sphere, right? Which is a legitimate mathematical object to talk about. At least I think so. But anyway, like, there are high dimensional mathematical objects that, like, have no obvious physical analog, but they're perfectly valid constructs in mathematics. And one could say that they exist in a certain sense, depending on whether you're a Platonist or not. Yeah, so within the space of mathematical objects, there isn't that much space to make differentiation. So you can talk about computation also, as because we talked about functionalism, right? So you can say in a certain sense that, like, that computation is a kind of mathematical object because Turing machines are a kind of mathematical object. So also in information also, I would put under the category of mathematical objects, because at least in sort of the standard information theory definition, right? Information is basically a property of random variables, which are mathematical objects. Now, if you talk to the integrated information theory people, they will have a different information definition of information. I don't really know what they're on about. So that's sort of the world of, like, mathematical objects. And then there's the world of physics, right? You have tables and chairs, but a lot of the things that physicists talk about are not tables and chairs, right? So the things that exist in the world of physics are, you have subatomic particles. That's fine, but you also have energy. Now, what's energy? Well, physicists will tell you it's a quantity that's conserved in a closed system and has such and such properties. And if you ask a physicist, well, like, what actually is an atom made of? So they'll say, well, it's protons, neutrons, and electrons. And then they'll tell you it's quarks and leptons. Then when you get down to it, they'll tell you it's actually fluctuations in some mathematical space, some like field, some force field or something like that. And so if you ask a physicist what are the objects that physics describes, or you'd get a very complicated answer. Right? They might not know themselves, right? So trying to, like, reduce something to physics, in a sense, does not solve a lot of problems for you. I think that maybe, like, back before, I don't know, in, like, the 1800s, it's like physics is, it's Newton. It's like, billiard balls, everything is like rocks and stuff moving. But physics today looks nothing like that. So physics today is, like, describes a bunch of, like, very weird things. And a lot of the physicists will actually start telling you that, like, no, what the universe actually is like these mathematical constructs.
Well, I
So
mean, just to interject a little bit, like, even if it gets really vague and complicated at the very low level, the things built up on top of it seem to have a lot of explaining power. So without getting into, what's inside quarks and leptons, we could do a lot with physics, and we've explained a lot. So I don't know if that invalidates in general trying to reduce something to physics.
yeah, okay, no, so that's a good point. So there are a lot of things that physics can explain. So you have to so when you think about consciousness, first you have to ask the questions. First of all, like, which of these initial buckets does it fall into? Right? Does it fall into the physicalist bucket, right? So does it fit into the set of things that physics describes? Does it fit into the bucket of mathematical objects? or does it fit into neither of those two categories? And my intuition, just as like a preliminary intuition, is that it does not obviously fall into either of those categories. For consciousness, right, the experience of the taste of a pickle is not a mathematical object. Like I don't know how you square that circle. Now, if you say it's a physical object, so to me, in a sense, one of the things that is fundamental to what physics is that physics describes things that have units, right? So, you could talk about, you can talk about the mass of an object or the velocity or acceleration, and these things come in terms of like grams or miles per hour or whatever you want. But when you talk about like the taste of a pickle, it's like what are the units, what are the tastes, right? So you can like have a psychology experiment where it's like, well, you say, oh, it's this spicy and that sour and so on. Those, in a sense, those aren't really units of the experience. Those are like units of kind of language that you're using to describe the experience, right? Like in a certain sense, the actual thing that you're is under discussion is not something that is measurable by the standard tools of physics. Right. Physics, right, and the concept of units also is something that comes from like experiments, right? So you have some sort of um measuring stick that everybody agrees, okay, like this is the this is a meter or whatever. And then we could say how many meters is this thing? How many miles per hour is this thing? Because there can be like a consensus the about what the metric is, and also what the object under question, like what value it gets on that metric. You can't really do this with conscious experience. Yeah, like it's hard for me to understand really what a physicalist theory would accomplish, because at the end of the day, like what are theories in physics, like what is an explanation in physics, right? Normally an explanation in physics, like it's not really an explanation so much as you have an equation, right? So if you want to understand the effect of gravity on an apple, so you have sort of equation that says, oh, if I drop the apple from this height and it's on earth, right, it will fall at such and such a rate. So the question is, like, if I have in, if you come and tell me as the smartest consciousness researcher in the world, and you say, I've solved consciousness, look at this equation, right? What will be on like the left-hand side of the equation and the right-hand side of the equation? Like I
I
don't need
mean,
to know, I don't need to know exactly what's on it, but I'm saying, like, I know for the apple that falls down, I know that like on one side of the equation it will be, the acceleration, and on the other side of the equation will be like its position. Right? When it comes to consciousness, I don't even know like what I'm solving for.
even if it still seems very different than other scientific theories, they could have a theory where in such and such situation, consciousness will arise. So even if it doesn't fully explain it mechanistically, and like we were able to do in biology, it still would be a scientific theory saying in these physical circumstances, we predict this, consciousness will arise. So that would still fit within, it maybe be more like a theory of physics than a theory of biology, because it kind of is just postulating something that without reducing it down to the atoms in a way. But that would still be like a more standard scientific theory than dualism.
Sure. So right. So I agree in theory that would fit the form of the that yeah. So you can come up with an equation that answers that question in theory. In practice, though, it is not a solvable problem because you can't test for consciousness. Right. Because normally, right, if you ask ChatGPT, are you conscious? It will say no, but then it will tell you that that's because that's what its system prompt told it to say. So you don't really know, and even if it gave the wrong answer, so you don't know for sure if it's like even if it didn't have that system prompt, it could be lying to you. And
I
I
mean, I agree there's no way
yeah
to know for sure because it could always be lying, but let's imagine we knew ChatGPT was extremely honest and we tested it in all these other ways and we didn't force it with a system prompt to lie. So in such a case, I mean, I get how there's questions in it, but you could say, okay, we asked it and it said it wasn't conscious, and we probably could trust it. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, that's it's like my strong intuition, just because like I know how AI works, is just say like it will input output. Ultimately, it will be a function of its training, right? Because I know how it works and I know what's going on inside. So I know that it's trained on all this text and stuff. And so it will output to me the most likely answer, right? The most likely sentence completion based on the text. And it's also right. So you say, oh well, let's say that you knew that it were honest, but you can only verify its honesty on uh on questions that are of a category that is testable. Right. The questions about consciousness might be a categorically different kind of question that it is not honest about, right?
right. I mean, I
Because
don't
like,
deny
yeah,
that, but I feel like it might still give us an indication. Let's say we asked it a lot of questions about how it thinks and all sorts of things like that that aren't the hard problem, consciousness. And we're able to tell that it's answering them accurately. So then we might think, I agree, this isn't exactly the same, but we might say, okay, there's a strong probability that when it answers that question, it's also answering it accurately. I'm talking about some like future version of ChatGPT.
yeah. Look, my strong intuition is to say that it's not a valid way of test, because so like if you have very smart seeming GPT, which I mean current GPT is pretty smart, right? So you have to think about if it says yes and if it says no. Right, you have to think about both those cases, and I think that you have to ask also generally, when you ask GPT a question about itself, what information is it drawing on? So
Right now,
yeah,
it's probably not drawing on anything that's so accurate, but imagine a future version that's like super introspective, even ignoring consciousness. It might start giving you very accurate answers about itself. And then you could wonder, well, maybe it could also answer this question.
yeah. Uh, I hear what you're saying. So when you say questions about itself, does that mean like if I ask it to like give me its weights, its model weights, like it could do it, but that
Yeah, or its thinking process or things like that, which right now it currently sometimes just makes up. But I could imagine in the future, maybe it could like really describe its thinking process, its motivations even on a non-conscious level, like what's what's incentivizing it. And then I agree it's a slightly different category, but we could be like, oh, maybe it's also able to answer this question and it's not meaningless. It's
yeah. So I would say that if it says yes, I might be inclined to honor that to some degree, because ultimately, like I don't know that you're conscious either. And I don't fully know how you work. I don't fully know how GPT works. I understand a bit about neuroscience, so I do understand a bit about brains, about how brains work. I don't know if I know more or less about your brain than I know about GPT. Now, if I were a machine learning engineer, if I like were a machine learning engineer who like really understood how GPT works, I might say, well, you know what, this is just linear algebra. I understand how every piece of this works. Like, there's no way that this can possibly be conscious. And I think, like, for a simpler artificial neural network, I would say that, right? Because if it's just like a standard feed-forward neural network, it's like this is just linear algebra. Once you get to the level of complexity of these large language models that are trillions of parameters and have a lot of stuff going on, yeah, I would give it some credence if it said yes, right? The question is, if it says no, do I believe it 100%? That's also a question that I'm not sure about. But anyway, so just getting back to like my view. So I am a dualist. Like I said, I do think that consciousness is something that is categorically different than matter or computation. I think that doesn't preclude an AI from having it. It just means that you need something else in your model of the universe to get you there. So yeah, but anyway, to answer your question, so is there actually a verifiable equation in physics that would tell me under what circumstances is something conscious? Again, I still think that you have the same problem of it's not really testable. So like it may be, like I said, like I might believe GPT 10%, right? But you don't have a rule that sort of tells you with certainty. It tells you with certainty, or sorry, you don't have an experiment that tells you with certainty whether a particular agent is conscious or not, right? So for example, like there's also the view of panpsychism, Right. And so under panpsychism, like everything is conscious. Like rocks are conscious, and so everything is conscious. I think is kind of a weird view. But in a certain sense, it's like, well, do you sort of assume a priori that rocks are conscious, or do you assume a priori that they're not conscious? Right? Because that has a big difference for what your equation will look like. Right. So you really need to know sort of for every object, or at least category of object, whether it's conscious or not, before you write down your equation. And that experiment of determining whether something is conscious or not is just not doable. Maybe you can claim it's doable for entities that have like language communication abilities, but again, that's you run into the Chinese room experiment problem and the pea zombie problem. Right.
Do you
You
think
always, yeah.
consciousness has an impact on the world? Is it doing something functional in the world, or it's just kind of this like passive bystander?
I'm open to both views. So I think that the existence of consciousness, even dualist consciousness, is perfectly consistent with a world where where it has no impact. I think it's perfectly consistent. The alternative view is probably the free will view, right? Which says that like somehow your conscious experience and your conscious thoughts can somehow direct your body, direct your brain to make decisions that it wouldn't have automatically made. I will say that like this sort of neuroscience generally operates kind of under the assumption that free will is not a thing. So the sort of default assumption of neuroscientists is that if an animal exhibits a certain behavior, it's like I can decode from its neurons why it exhibited that behavior, and it's basically deterministic. And maybe there are some like quantum effects or something, but for all intents and purposes, the assumption is kind of that it's deterministic. Now, what do I want to say? Yeah. So I think given that consciousness exists, it would be kind of funny if it didn't have an impact, but it's possible. So
I
I've been
mean, even
agnostic to that.
even without getting into free will, it could be consciousness has an impact because conscious beings will do things differently. Like, they'll feel feelings in a way that doesn't just map onto a computational state, or they'll care about other people or ethical rules. Different things like that. I mean, some of it maybe could just map onto a very simple computational state, like pain could be actually experienced or it could just be a way to get away from something. Some of it maybe is a little more difficult, and then that would be the impact of it. But if it does have an impact, then maybe there's a way to measure that, because you could observe a group and then see, do they do things as conscious entities would do, or do they do things that, non-conscious entities do?
I don't think that you can really distinguish so because look, it is true that people do things differently when they're in different emotional states, but ultimately there there has to be a deterministic kind of physicalist explanation for behavior because like in order for you to do something differently, you have to move your muscles. Right. In order to move your muscles, there has to be some signal sent from your brain down your spinal cord. And like those signals have to be there. They can't not be there. And those signals presumably have to come from somewhere. So unless you are generating an action potential out of thin air, you kind of have to have a physicalist explanation of behavior, because if you didn't, you would be violating some physical laws.
So then, according to your perspective, then it's more likely it does nothing, because if it's separate from the physical brain in some way, then it also would be hard for it to have any influence on actions.
Yeah, I think that is, yeah, that is like it, I think it is hard to make free will consistent with physics. Consciousness, I think, is easier. No, there is a bit of a problem with consciousness also that has to do with like Landauer's principle and thermodynamics and information erasure. But I won't get into that because I'm not an expert in that sort of thing.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think on the question of AI, I think, whether or not it could someday be conscious, right now they haven't done anything in any way moving towards that direction. They've just built something that does language and is very connected with intelligence. But intelligence and consciousness just seem like separate things. Like emotions, at least how we feel them, seem much more tied up to the issue, and there's no reason to think it experiences emotions.
I don't think that emotions are particularly unique, right? It's a subjective experience of any sense. So I don't think that the subjective experience of being happy or sad is more of a conscious experience than the subjective experience of thinking, right? I think that those are, from a consciousness perspective, those are just different states. But I don't think that an emotional state is more sort of salient, is more of a conscious than a different kind of state.
Well, I mean, it's easy to describe thinking without any consciousness, not the felt experience of it, but the idea of, given certain inputs, solve the problem and produce an output. For emotions, it seems a little more difficult. I mean, I get how one could describe a computational state of agitation, but it seems it's much more strongly connected to a felt experience in a sense. So that's why it just seems like if we were simulating emotions, that would raise much more questions.